Hi, my name is Brendan Cunningham. I'm a professor of economics in the Economics and Finance Department at Eastern Connecticut State University. This is my presentation on the economics of racism. This is going to be a literature review for a national 2 days of action called ScholarStrike. I'll briefly just read what this day of action is about and where it came from. ScholarStrike is an action inspired by the NBA, WNBA, Colin Kaepernick, and other athletes to underscore the urgent importance of addressing racism and injustice in the United States. ScholarStrike was conceived via tweet by Anthea Butler and is designed to call awareness to the racial climate in America and the rash of police shootings and racialized violence. What I hope to do in this presentation is talk a little bit about the economics literature on the topic of discrimination and racism. Just offer an overview of the presentation to begin. I'll start with an introduction where I lay out some concepts and foundations for what I'll be talking about throughout this discussion. I'll cover the early economics literature dating to the 20th century, sort of the middle 20th century, on the topic of discrimination. In fact, I'm really only going to be focusing on sort of the canonical origin paper on the economics of discrimination. I'll talk a little bit about some contemporary economics pertaining to racism and discrimination, and then I'll wrap up with a conclusion at the very end. So to begin with the introduction, there's three sort of foundational topics I'd like to begin with. I'd like to begin with a territory acknowledgement. This is an acknowledgement which finds its origins in Canada and the effort of people there to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of Canada. I'll talk about the spirit with which I'm putting this presentation together. It's a spirit of allyship, and I believe allyship is important for a lot of different reasons. So I'll offer some very brief comments on the concept of allyship, and then I'll talk a little bit about the concept of anti-racism and sort of the philosophy underpinning the notion of anti-racism. So to begin with the territory acknowledgement, I would like to acknowledge the traditional and ancestral territory of the Western Nahantic and Mohegan tribes on which I am speaking today. I think it's important to acknowledge the land because I am descended from immigrants. Indigenous people and their struggles are often talked about in the past tense, and I'd like to commit myself to the struggle against the systems of oppression that have dispossessed Indigenous people of their lands and denied their rights to self-determination. On this slide, I've offered a picture of Zacchaeus Nunsuch. He was a member of the Nahantic tribe and the state of Connecticut's designated Nahantic overseer from 1851 to 1867. Turning to the concept of allyship, as I mentioned earlier, my hope is to pursue 4 principles of allyship in this presentation. These are 4 principles I try to pursue when I'm thinking about what I might do when it comes to issues of discrimination for various communities. This is my effort to speak up as an ally and talk about the topic of racism and discrimination. I've done the best I can, and I do think it's extremely important to listen and learn from disadvantaged communities. Really listen, set aside preconceived notions, hear what people are saying who are impacted by discrimination or racism of some kind. Learn from what they tell you. Educate yourself, read. Your participation in watching this video is an example of educating yourself, and show up to efforts to change the world for the better and alter the course of discrimination and racism, which occurs wherever you are. I am considered white by society, so I acknowledge that while I've done my best to listen and learn and share from what I've heard and learned, there are many aspects of discrimination and racism which I may not do adequate service to in this presentation. The most recent book I've read in an attempt to educate myself is a book by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. Here is his picture. He's the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities, a professor of history, and the director of the Center for Anti-Racist Research at Boston University. Dr. Kendi's book, entitled How to Be an Anti-Racist, offers many important insights, and I've included two of them here, but I'd encourage you to read this book. It's a very fascinating discussion of racism, anti-racism, and ways to address racism in society. Kendi offers the following insight regarding racism. He says, there is no neutrality in the racism struggle. The opposite of racist isn't not racist. It is anti-racist. With that statement, Kendi offers a very clear demarcation between things which are racist in our world and things which are anti-racist, and there is nothing in between. Kendi notes that an anti-racist locates the roots of problems in power and policies, and an anti-racist will confront racial inequities. So an anti-racist contribution is one which reduces racial inequities. And I'll make reference to Kendi's work as I go along a little bit further. So now let's talk a little bit about my field of specialization, economics, and probably the origin effort to address the topic of discrimination and racism in the field of economics. Most would credit Professor Gary Becker from the University of Chicago with probably one of the most significant early contributions to the literature on the economics of discrimination in a book with that title, The Economics of Discrimination, which he published in 1957. Professor Becker was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1992, not only for his work on the economics of discrimination, but also for the work he did on the economics of the family. In his book, Professor Becker and a lot of subsequent literature was focused upon the question of discrimination in labor markets. That is the place where people go to find employment, in the place where companies and businesses go to find employees. It's not actually one place, it's many places, but it can be convenient to think of a labor market as an actual place. So in order to talk about Professor Becker's view on the economics of discrimination, I'd like to start with some basics when it comes to the idea of labor markets, and then talk a little bit about how discrimination might manifest itself in labor markets. So the basic notion in labor economics, we have a very standard theory, which is that employers in most sort of market-based systems, they will try to maximize profits. And I won't go into the details behind why this is the case, but when it is true that employers are pursuing profits, the price of their product will end up being equal to the wage paid to employees times a measure of an employee's productivity. So let me just talk a little bit about what that means when it comes to the subject of discrimination. So when Becker asked what discrimination is in labor markets, he said, let's imagine that there is a group of people, let's call them Group A, and among that group of people, this maxim of profit maximization holds, so that the price is equal to the wage paid to people in this group times their productivity. One way to interpret Becker's work is to imagine that there's a second group of people that faces discrimination, in the sense that they are not paid what the people in Group A are paid. They're paid less than that. That is the discrimination they face. So the wages in Group B would be less than the wages in Group A. This is a violation of the profit maximizing principle. It also means that when an employer does discriminate, the employer can potentially receive more profit from employing people from Group B because you're not paying them as much. So assuming equal productivity across the two groups, it's more profitable to employ a person from Group B. Becker pointed out then that discrimination should not be something discrimination in wages, would not be something we would see persisting over time, because those competing with an employer that is discriminating will seek to hire away these individuals from Group B who are being paid low wages. They will offer slightly higher wages. They will, in effect, take the profit that the discriminating employer is creating through discrimination, and they will hire away the Group B individuals. In essence, this means that the individuals who face discrimination should be in high demand as employees from other companies competing with the discriminator, and so those facing discrimination should eventually see their wages increase. And discrimination in a competitive market would not last. That was Becker's sort of theory of discrimination and prediction. Like most theories, sort of like the geocentric theory, which was a theory that the Earth is the center of the universe, it may or may not be accurate. And that's something we're going to talk a little bit more about as we move forward from 1957 into the more recent literature on racism and discrimination published by economists. So I'll now turn from Becker's work to more contemporary economics, hailing from the second half of the 20th century into the 21st century. The literature I'll present here, unlike Becker's work that I just mentioned, is all peer-reviewed in some of the top journals in the field of economics. The first I'll mention was written by two economists, Neal and Johnson, and published in 1996. The authors were exploring wage differences by race and asked if those wage differences could be explained by test results. The wages they observe in their data set were matched with results from academic tests that people took. And they did find that racial wage differences could be explained by performance on those tests. But the question then becomes, are the tests themselves biased? And also, this is an observational study, so it's just a result of inference from data created by the wages people actually earn and also the test performance that they exhibited. This was not a randomized controlled trial of any sort, and observational studies have a whole host of challenges in terms of reliability, including the possibility that things are mismeasured and or things are omitted from the study. So I'll go back to Kendi's book on how to be an anti-racist, and I have a quote here from that book. And in Kendi's view, the use of standardized tests to measure aptitude and intelligence is one of the most effective racist policies ever devised. This may seem like something of a controversial quote from Kendi. A lot of standardized testing is something we see a great deal of throughout education. But we have to go back to Kendi's definition of racism and anti-racism. Anti-racism is anything which diminishes racial inequalities. And Kendi points out here that standardized test results have, over time, limited the ability of certain communities to join certain schools. And because of that, inequalities are perpetuated over time. So in order to think a little bit more about Neal and Johnson's result that wage differences racial wage differences can be explained by test results, it's helpful to now also consider the fact that the tests themselves could be racially biased. So we haven't really necessarily answered the question of whether wage differences are a consequence of discrimination. So let's move forward to some more recent literature from this century. And the sort of observational efforts that I described when it came to the prior study, those have continued into the 21st century. So I'll talk a little bit more about those observational studies that in some ways are done with more nuanced data and nuanced methodologies. And then I'll talk a little bit about some field experiment papers which employ a methodology much closer to a randomized controlled trial. And so the results from those field experiments tend to have arguably more reliability. But let's begin with the observational studies first. Let's start with a paper by Charles and Gurian in 2008. These researchers accessed data from the Census Bureau in the United States on 2 questions measuring racism and prejudice in different regions of the country. They had data on the number of people in a region who opposed interracial marriage, and also the number of people who would refuse to ever vote for a Black president. And the authors used these measures as measures of prejudice in certain regions. Following careful empirical analysis, they found that greater measured racism in a particular region was associated with Blacks earning less relative to whites. A quote from that paper is that estimates suggest that 1/4 of the racial wage gap is due to prejudice, with non-trivial consequences for Black lifetime earnings. Moving forward 2 years, we have a paper from Price and Wolfers which focuses on sports, specifically the NBA. The authors note that in professional basketball, referees are randomly assigned to games, which offers a natural experiment to investigate the role of race in basketball. They find that more personal fouls are awarded against players when they are officiated by an opposite race officiating crew than when they are officiated by an own race refereeing crew. So the authors pointed out that race does play a role in outcomes which should, by most accounts, should be race neutral. That is, whether a foul has taken place on a basketball court. More recently, Arnold, Dobbie, and Yang in 2018 employed data from Miami and Philadelphia to investigate criminal justice issues. They observed that bail judges are assigned to cases in a quasi-random manner, and the authors found that bail judges are racially biased against Black defendants, with substantially more racial bias among both inexperienced and part-time judges. Continuing with the empirical literature on criminal justice, Roland Fryer in 2019 published a study of police use of force. A quote from his study is that Black and Hispanics are more than 50% more likely to experience some form of force in interactions with police. That use of force cannot be explained by available data on the context in which the police interaction took place or the behavior of the civilian in that interaction. Fryer notes that his result is consistent with a model in which police officers are utility maximizers, a fraction of whom have a preference for discrimination. So now let's turn to the field experiments, and I'd like to just offer a couple of words about what a field experiment is. In a field experiment, the researcher, in essence, creates a placebo and a treatment in some kind of economic interaction. So, for example, a field experiment exploring discrimination in hiring might involve employing 2 actors who go into job interviews. And the researchers try to keep as many characteristics of the 2 actors constant as possible or equal, and only have some kind of racial difference in the 2 actors. Researchers will then try to see if the outcomes of that interaction in the field are different across the 2 individuals. In 2002, Riash and Rich published a literature review of field experiments spanning a long period of time in many countries. They describe the results from matched pairs of, there's a typo here, but bogus transactors, quote unquote, over 30 years in 10 different countries. The authors find significant, persistent, and pervasive levels of discrimination against non-whites and women in multiple markets like labor, housing, and product markets. Product markets are just markets where you buy a good or a service of some kind. The literature they review find rates of employment discrimination against non-whites in excess of 25%, and this evidence comes from Australia, Europe, and North America. In 2004, Bertrand and Mullainathan added to this literature in a paper called Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakisha and Jamal, a field experiment on labor market discrimination. We have data from the Social Security system, which indicates to us the types of names which are chosen by different groups in the United States, and certain names are more frequently chosen by different groups. The authors study race in the labor market by sending fictitious resumes to help wanted ads in Boston and Chicago newspapers. To manipulate perceived race, resumes are randomly assigned African American or white-sounding names. Those names were selected from the Social Security data on names chosen by groups. The resumes are kept constant across these different categories because of the random assignment. The authors found that white names receive 50% more callbacks for interviews. Callbacks are also more responsive to resume quality for white names than for African American names. So this is still more evidence of discrimination in labor markets. More recently, in 2015, Ayres, Banaji, and Jolls turned to product markets. They turned to eBay, where individuals participate in auctions to buy good, mostly products. eBay has a very large market with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of transactions. The authors investigate the impact of seller race in a field experiment involving baseball card auctions on eBay. Photographs showed the cards held by either a dark-skinned African-American hand or a light-skinned Caucasian hand. Cards held by African-American sellers sold for approximately 20% less than cards held by Caucasian sellers. So this is also evidence that there's some discrimination by race in how much people are willing to pay for products depending upon who the seller is. Edelman, Luca, and Svirsky take some time to look at the question of racism and discrimination in the so-called sharing economy. They focus on Airbnb, which is a service in which property owners offer up for temporary rent their property for people to stay in during a holiday or something like that. The researchers create fictitious attempts at reserving rental accommodations and find that applications from guests with distinctively African American names are 16% less likely to be accepted relative to identical guests with distinctively white names. The discrimination occurs among landlords of all sizes, including small landlords sharing the property and larger landlords with multiple properties. So this is yet another market. In this case, we can think of it as a service market in which you're renting lodging, where certain racial groups have a harder time participating in that market. So that, by and large, serves as a review of some of the main papers published under peer review in quality outlets, which establish that racism of various ways, shapes, and form takes place in labor markets, product markets, service markets, and also criminal justice. Most of those studies are from the modern era in which discrimination is by and large illegal in those markets, yet it is still occurring in an observable manner. So I'd like to just wrap up with a conclusion. As I just mentioned, there's ample, reliable evidence of ongoing racial discrimination in multiple dimensions of modern life. Allyship, I believe, is important in making progress and remedying the situation, or at least improving it. I will offer one more hint that remedies are possible, and this comes from a recent paper by Pope, Price, and Wolfers, who go back to professional basketball and investigate if discrimination in penalty calling, or I should say foul counting, is ongoing. And what they discover is that the discrimination in fouls called by referees in the NBA has declined to the point where they can no longer pick it up in most circumstances. The authors attribute this to the fact that the NBA became very aware of their research and collaborated with referees to help them understand their own biases. And this, to some extent, improved the discrimination which was ongoing in referee calls during games. There's the beginning of an early literature which suggests that educating oneself about biases can at least begin to remedy the circumstances. But the solutions to what is identified in the literature are still not very well formed, and most likely represent the greatest opportunity for ongoing research. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope this was helpful. I will add links to the studies I cited in this discussion to the description of the video. And thanks again for watching.